Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Yossi Klein Halevi and Bret Stephens. Just so you all know, both of you too, that we hope this is more of a conversation than really an interview. So please feel free to respond or ask questions of the other. And now I realize that the subject for tonight's conversation is Israel and the Six-Day War, but let's get this out of the way first. So Bret, tell us about your move to the Times. Any interesting experiences? Seamless, smooth?
Yeah, I've gotten this question quite a bit in the last few weeks, and the answer I've arrived at is that I was so sick of being hated for my never Trump views that I thought it would be wise to go to a place where I'd be hated for all of my other views.
All right, back on topic then. So, Yossi, you grew up in Brooklyn, and your father was a survivor.
I was circumcised in Brooklyn.
Well, next question then. As you've written, you came of age really during the Six-Day War. So, what was the impact of the Six-Day War in your life?
Well, first I just wanted to say how thrilled I am, first of all, to be with you, Bret, and how thrilled I am that you're at the Times. And we really need you there. The question?
The impact of the Six-Day War in your life.
On my life. My most formative Israel experience was watching the news with my father in May 1967. And my father was a survivor from Hungary, and the experience of seeing the news through his eyes and of vicariously taking on his fears, and they became my fears, shaped my relationship with Israel really to this day. And we went through, those of you, I think most of you here, or many of you, will remember those days. And there was an emotional trajectory that began with existential fear that then turned into relief when we realized the extent of, when we realized that Israel was winning and had taken the initiative, and then finally became euphoria when we understood just what an extraordinary victory Israel had won. Now that summer, my father and I flew to Israel. He had two brothers who had survived the war and who he hadn't seen since the war. And somehow the events of May and June '67 made it impossible to keep away. We had to be in Israel. I was 14 at the time, and I always say that the Six-Day War ruined my life because I made Aliyah because of that war and the experience that I had in Israel that summer. I fell in love with Israel at its most magnificent moment. It was really the moment of the happy ending of Jewish history, or so we thought then. And Israelis genuinely believed that it's over. The wars are over, and we won. We are the generation that are the victors of Jewish history. Now, to some extent, I think that that's true. I think we are the generation that are the victors of Jewish history, with some caveats.
And Bret, you like me, were not alive for the Six-Day War. But what led you to have that connection with Israel? What led you to become editor of Jerusalem Post and to feel strongly about Israel?
Well, I became editor of the Jerusalem Post mainly by way of bribery. You laugh. No. My mother was born in Nazi-occupied Europe in 1940. In Milano. She only learned she was Jewish after she and her mother arrived in this country with $7 between them as displaced persons. And her mother enrolled her at the child care on the synagogue on West 76th Street. My mother said, "What am I doing here? You're Jewish." But on her extended family, she came to America. The other half of the family went to Israel and ended up on Kibbutz Hefsiba near Afula. So even though I was raised, I joke about this, in a home that was as minimally Jewish as you can be without actually being Unitarian, we were Zionists from the very beginning. And one of my earliest memories was the 1982 Lebanon War, in which my father brought out a map of the Middle East and drew arrows as Israel advanced towards Beirut to kick out that son of a bitch Yasser Arafat. That was the kind of household in which I was raised. When I was 16, I spent a summer on Hefsiba. So Zionism was in my guts for some time. But that was an emotional connection. What happened on an intellectual level was the summer of 2000, I was working for the Wall Street Journal based in Brussels. And the Camp David Accords had just failed, and Arafat was threatening to declare a state on what would be the 7th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. This was a kind of a small little diplomatic crisis that's now long forgotten, but at the time it was a big deal. And so my editor said, "I want you to go out to Israel. I want you to spend your time among the Palestinians, and I want you to write a story about what kind of state Palestine would be if Arafat were to declare it." And so instead of spending my time in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem on the western side, I spent it almost entirely in Gaza and Ramallah and so on. And I wrote a piece that was called "Palestine, the Dream and the Nightmare," which appeared on the 21st of September of 2000, exactly 9 days before the Intifada began, the Second Intifada. And the essence of the piece was most Westerners think that a Palestinian state is going to look like the American Colony Hotel, beautiful, verdant, exotic, lovely Palestinian waiters, and so on. But what a Palestinian state really is a kleptocracy edging into fanatical theocracy. And I wrote that piece, and then the Intifada broke out, and as I said, I was based in Brussels, and I was shocked out of my mind at what I felt was the rank anti-Semitism emerging from respectable publications in response to the Intifada, because it was clear to me that the discontents welling within a dysfunctional Palestinian society had been harnessed by Arafat to start an intifada to gain diplomatically what he had lost at Camp David. But the way it was treated in the Western press was very different. I remember there was an editorial in The Economist magazine, and I'm paraphrasing here, but I think the quote is almost exact. It said, "Israelis are a superior people, their talents are above the ordinary, but they must curb their greed for other people's land." And I remember thinking, if you just said, Jews are a superior people, their talents are above their ordinary, but they must curb their greed for other people's money, you would have as classic an anti-Semitic trope as you can imagine. And so the experience of seeing what Palestine really was, as opposed to the way in which it was mythologized in the Western press, and then the more visceral experience of seeing what struck me as a kind of unfiltered or barely filtered anti-Semitism is what kind of brought me into action. I felt like there was a story here that the Western press, out of either ill will or simply foolishness, was getting wrong, and that I could help put to rights. And so that was the catalyst which eventually, over a couple years, led to my becoming the editor of the Jerusalem Post, and then you know the rest.
This is probably something you can both speak to. How do you think, as journalists who've worked in America and in Israel, how do the different readers, the Israeli readers and the American readers, how do they differ in terms of their Middle East coverage and what they expect and what they like or expect?
The truth is that I have barely worked in the United States. I moved to Israel in 1982, shortly after graduating from journalism school, and my goal was always, really, since as I say, since the Six-Day War, my path was heading toward Israel, and the question for me was always, what took me so long? And because I was ready in the summer of '67, in fact, I told my father, you go home, I'm staying. And it seemed a reasonable plan at the time. I was starting high school, and I'll find my way. And he said no, and I said yes, and well. So it took me a while to get back to Israel, but I really did not have the experience of working here. And so although I have most of my professional life was writing from Israel for you. I've been writing for American audiences, I'd say primarily American Jewish audiences, for most of my career. Mm-hmm. So it's a very specific niche, and I'm not quite sure how to respond to your question. I know that the audiences that I write for generally feel some relationship with Israel. And so the responsibility that I've felt over these years was to be a kind of translator. And the one image that I had for the role that I've tried to play was, the biblical spies that were sent from the desert to explore the land and come back with reports. And I felt that the American Jewish community needed its spies in the land. Tell us what's really going on in that wonderful, strange country. And a good part of my immersion in Israeli society was this sense of I could have very easily been one of my readers back in America. And I felt this responsibility for trying to explain the complexities and what I learned about Israel, the good, the less good, and to really try to help people, American Jews, again, primarily, who care about Israel, who love Israel, to understand Israel. Because I grew up in an American Jewish community in the 1960s that cared passionately about Israel, but knew absolutely nothing about Israel. We didn't know about any of the social problems, and I think that we've done a great injustice to the American Jewish community by taking so long to make Israel a real place. And we're now paying the price for that with young people, many of whom feel betrayed. You never told us the truth. And I certainly didn't know the truth growing up. And I think the truth about Israel is strong enough and powerful enough that it can withstand scrutiny. And so I've tried in these 30 plus years of living in Israel to write as in the most honest way I can about what I see and experience there for readers who I think want to know what the real Israel is about.
I speak frequently at Jewish events to Jewish audiences, but the audiences for which I write are not necessarily Jewish audiences, and I'm conscious of that. I wrote a column called Global View, and you always knew the guy who was writing you was an anti-Semite when he'd say, all you do is write about Israel. And I actually, I don't want to say rarely, but didn't frequently write about Israel. Look, I'm tempted to answer your question with a kind of paradox, which is that when I was in Israel, I wrote for readers who understood that Israel was not the center of the universe. And at least when I write about Middle Eastern issues for American readers, I'm writing for readers with the misimpression that Israel is the center of the universe. And I mean that in the sense that for years, it was a struggle I had to wage to persuade American readers that when you spoke about, for example, Middle East peace, that would require peace between Sunnis and Shia. It would require a new way of governance in the Middle East. But Middle East peace should never be taken as a synonym for Arab-Israeli peace, much less Israeli-Palestinian peace, because solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if there's ever going to be a solution, will have no effect on the bloodletting in Syria, the repression in Turkey, the civil war in Yemen, or any of the other distempers of the region. So one of my challenges as a writer is to say, refocus on what's happening in the region rather than on this illusion that if only those Israelis could get out of those damn settlements, everything would be, fine and good. That's been the challenge I've struggled with. I think Israelis are much more conscious of the fact that they are a small country who barely have agency over themselves, never mind what's going around in the region. I'm attracted by this paradox, but not sold on it, because if I were to think about it a little more thoroughly, I wonder if I would come to the same conclusion. But it sounds pretty good for an answer.
All right. Well, what do you make of the fact that the Israeli public seems to be increasingly pessimistic about the viability of a two-state solution, whereas it seems that in the United States, the public seems to be saying, even mainstream, even a lot of the right-wingers seems to say that a two-state solution is the only way that there can be any peace process to go through.
I often find a disconnect when I speak to American Jewish audiences. I feel that I'm in a kind of a time warp. When I speak to Orthodox audiences, right-wing audiences, I feel it's the 1980s, and Menachem Begin or Yitzhak Shamir are still prime minister, and the first intifada has not yet happened. And all we need to do is stake our claim to what's ours, keep building in the settlements, and somehow it will be okay. When I speak to liberal Jewish audiences, it's the 1990s, and the second intifada has not yet happened, and it's the good old days of the Oslo process. And all we have to do is be determined enough to sign the damn deal, stop building in the settlements. And most Israelis, I think, are not in either place anymore. A majority of Israelis are a little bit left and a little bit right at the same time, which is to say that we've internalized the argument. And the way that I put it to myself, and it's actually sometimes literally so, I have left-wing mornings and I have right-wing mornings. I have mornings when I wake up and I say, whatever we have to do, just cut it. Get out, even if it means, and it will mean, rocket attacks on the heartland of Israel. We'll deal with it. And then I have other mornings when I wake up, I say, are you out of your mind? Look around. And you don't even have to look too far into the Middle East. Just look at our borders. Hezbollah, Hamas. There's no country in the world that faces that kind of enclosure to the extent that we do. So this is an argument that I find many American Jews have somehow missed. And I would actually phrase this in terms of a misunderstanding of Zionism. One of the great psychological insights of Zionism was that the Jews needed to be freed from political fantasies, and we needed to learn how to use power in the real world. This was a profound insight of Zionism. And if you think about just how Jews have been tempted by utopian fantasies, consider the vast number of young Jews who became communists and Stalinists in the early 20th and mid-20th centuries. In fact, I knew Stalinists growing up in Brooklyn. They were the last Stalinists on the planet,
One of them is
the Jews in Brooklyn.
from Vermont.
Did you hear that? Did you hear that comment?
Into the mic.
And what troubles me is that this profound achievement of Zionism, which was to wean Jews away from political fantasies, has suffered a profound reversal, partly as a result of the Six-Day War. I think that for all of the extraordinary gifts that the Six-Day War gave the Jewish people, both in Israel and the diaspora. One of the devastating consequences was the renewal of a Jewish politics of fantasy, both on the left and the right. The slogan, "Peace Now," should simply be retired from the Jewish lexicon. And the fact that so many, not in Israel anymore, but so many American Jews still believe that not only is a two-state solution desirable, and I believe that, given the options. I want a two-state solution. I don't believe it's possible anytime soon. The fact that you have an organization of young American Jews called If Not Now, When? And I think about that title and think about what now means in the Middle East. And creating a Palestinian state, Bret, you were talking about how dysfunctional Palestinian society was in the year 2000. Look at the Middle East. Which Arab state is Palestine likely to emulate? Will it be Syria? Will it be Iraq? Will it be Libya? The options are not great. And the notion that Palestine is somehow going to turn into as you put it, a model Middle Eastern state is simply a fantasy. And on the right, there's a different version of the Jewish politics of fantasy. And that is a denial, just as on the left you have a denial of the reality in the Middle East, on the right you have a denial of what it means for Israel to be permanently ruling another people. I can't say the word occupation in an Orthodox synagogue in America. I certainly can in Israel, because we all know that we're occupying, because we've all been soldiers and we've all been part of an occupation. We know what it's like. Now, I personally don't believe that we are occupying the land. I believe that we have a profound claim to that land, and Jews are not occupiers in Judea. But we are occupying the Palestinians. If I were to say that in certain synagogues in this country, I would be heckled, as in fact has happened. And not only are we not occupying the Palestinians, but the Palestinians don't exist. There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. How many of you have heard that? Now, when I hear that from right-wingers, the argument that follows is, well, the Palestinians are an invented people. And my response to that is, yes, of course they're an invented people. Every people is invented. That, in fact, is the definition of a people. At a certain point, a group of people decide that they are a people. But you invent yourself, you reinvent yourself. And so the left denies the acute dangers that a Palestinian state would pose. The right denies the need for a Palestinian state. And a majority of Israelis are not in either camp anymore. And that's really the disconnect that I feel.
I think, listening to Yossi, it's like listening to what your own thoughts would be if you were a little smarter. It's true. And what you capture is, and what I thought was so superb about your answer, is to say we live, the reality of Jewish power, of sovereignty, is to live with the encumbrances and complications of politics as they really are, and not as we wish them to be. And to understand that Jewish politics can't simply be a subset of Jewish ethics, that we have to exist in the world and navigate the world even as we attempt always to be attuned to what our ethical heritage needs to be about. And you're exactly right. I mean, Zionism is prone to a kind of utopia because it was supposed to be, at least in some of its versions, a solution to the Jewish problem. What we've discovered instead is that we've only reformulated that problem, but thankfully we've reformulated it with nuclear missiles so that the margin of safety between our problems and our existence has widened in a useful way, that we cannot be wiped out quite so easily. And there is among American Jews precisely this kind of idea that, well, if we just got out of all the settlements, what would that mean? Well, if you really talk to Peter Beinart, he'd say, well, problems would still exist, right? But he would feel better about himself. And I would say that one important point about Zionism is that Zionism did not become a force in the world so that those Jews who, for one reason or another, decided not to participate in it could feel better about themselves as Jews. Whatever else Zionism is, it's not a vehicle to wash away your sins or your misgivings or your guilt. I would add a second point here. And I was thinking about this with reference to Daniel Patrick Moynihan and his wonderful speech at the UN denouncing Zionism is Zionism is racism resolution. And what's so important about that speech is that, and so effective, is that Moynihan turns it around so that instead of us Jews, of course he wasn't Moynihan, honorary Jew. I'm sure there was some Jew way back when, but what he manages to do is to say, it's not for the United States, for Israel, to try to demonstrate that it has acquitted itself morally. It's for us to point out that your behavior is shameful, and you're the ones who are the problems here. To transform that, the onus, the moral onus, in a fundamental way. The reason I mention this is as follows. Look, Israel exists in a complicated place, right? But the fundamental complication is that Israel has a neighbor that at some root level refuses to recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state. That's the nature of the problem. If you were to tell, I'm sure, let me ask you, Yossi, imagine if God came down and said, get out of all the settlements, get out of French Hill, get out of even the Western Wall, and you'll have peace for 1,000 years. And you'll be able to visit Palestinian territory the way Americans visit Canada. How many Israelis would say no to that? Very few.
I live in French Hill. I took that very personally.
But that's my point. The nub of the problem is Palestinian rejectionism. The nub of the problem is not what happened in 1967, as consequential as that is. It's what happened in 1948. That's what this whole argument is still about. And what we ought to do, going back to what you said, is we ought to say, by all means, we want a two-state solution. We just want a two-state solution with Costa Rica. That is to say, small, demilitarized, democratic, cares for the welfare of its citizens, cares for the environment, is a responsible stakeholder in the world. And why can't we make that claim? Why can't we say to the Palestinians, there are lots of stateless people in the world, Kurds, Tamils, Tibetans, Catalans, and so on. Everyone has to essentially make a case for why their nationhood deserves statehood. And the Palestinians ought to be able to rise to the occasion and make that case, and we ought to be able to say, that's what we expect, that's what we're asking, because we don't want to midwife into existence another Yemen on Israel's borders that will soon be overtaken by ISIS, and the horrors that the Syrians experience now will be visited on Palestinians tomorrow. But that requires changing the way we have this conversation. Israel makes mistakes, Israel's in a complicated position, but the fundamental complication is the abiding refusal of too many Palestinians to come to grips with an Israeli state in any dimension. And that has to be said. That's the essential truth of this. And that's all there is to say in a way.
First, I think we're going to be coming around soon for the index cards, so just look out for people coming by. Just shifting over a little bit, I wanted to know about the American Jew right now. And has Israel lost this progressive, liberal American Jew? Is there going to be a point in the near future where the litmus test for Jews on whether they're Republicans or Democrats is how strongly they support Israel?
Well, that's one of my nightmares as an Israeli. And if we lose liberal American Jews, we've lost the Democratic Party. And I think the corollary is also true. If we succeed in keeping the loyalty of liberal American Jews, then I think that liberal America generally will not turn on Israel. And the reasons for why this is happening, I think, are very complicated. Some of them are Israel's fault. Some of them is the fault of the nature of liberal American Jewry and its failure, I think, to create a compelling strategy for Jewish continuity here. And but what is in Israel's control, and I agree with you, Bret, for the most part, about the dysfunctional nature of a Palestinian state. I still think that Israel has a responsibility, first of all, to itself, to be much more proactive, to at least keep putting an offer on the table that may be theoretical, but we need to keep reminding ourselves, our children who we send to the army, and the international community that we really are committed in principle to peace and to a two-state solution, and this government is conveying the opposite message. And again, that is not to put the onus for the absence of peace on Israel. Quite the opposite. I agree with you entirely on that. The onus needs to be where it belongs, and that's on the Palestinian leadership. All facets of the Palestinian national movement have rejected the legitimacy of Israel. Nevertheless, we need to remain, in principle, proactive, and there are changes that are happening in the region. And I think that if we were able to convey the deep commitment of Israel to an eventual two-state solution, I think that would have some impact on liberal Jews. The discourse in this country, the discourse within liberal America, is still nowhere near as pathological on Israel as it is in Europe. We have not yet lost, and I think that's really important to emphasize. And you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and I, like you, am, to say the least, not a fan. Nevertheless, he did go on Al Jazeera the other night and defend Israel in his convoluted way. But I think that's significant because the Bernie Sanders equivalent in Europe would not do that. Would not feel the political need to pay lip service to defending Israel in any way.
You know, just before we came on stage, Yossi and I were commiserating because we thought we're not even going to find any area of disagreement. But we found a small one to our mutual relief. Look, Israel is 69 years old. The United States was 69 years old in 1845. I just point that out to underscore what a young country Israel is. In 1845, America still had to confront all kinds of fundamental questions, massive problems, crises, and it did so. But these things take time, and they take, history has its own pace and it has its own reckonings. And I think that we have to make some allowance that there are probably almost half the room is older than the state of Israel. So give it some time. Give some time for these problems to sort themselves out. I have deep misgivings about the idea that Israel always has to be demonstrating its magnanimity. It has done so. And you don't want to make an offer that you know deep down, if taken at this moment, would critically endanger Israeli security. Because the reality right now is that Jordan is hanging on by a thread. And if you were to, say, create a Palestinian state today, tomorrow, and then watch Jordan implode the way Syria has, then Israel would find itself at the edge of chaos with no margin. Just imagine what might have happened if the negotiations between Ehud Barak and Hafez al-Assad had succeeded in 1999 at Shepherdstown, and the Golan Heights were now in Syrian hands. What the danger would be, never mind to Israel, the danger to the Druze of the Golan, where they might be. So I don't think Israel is under a kind of has an obligation always to demonstrate that at any time it's ready to give everything up. One more point that I just want to briefly make. You know, by the same token, liberal Jews also have, or progressive Jews, because I make a distinction between liberals and progressives, also have an obligation to think a little more soberly about their politics. It shouldn't be up to the rest of us to say, well, you see, these are the reasons. I mean, if you believe in gay rights, the only country where you can be gay in the Middle East openly is Israel. If you believe in women's rights, the only country where you'd want to be a woman is Israel. If you care for the environment, the only country that cares for the environment in the Middle East is Israel. If you think that politicians who commit crimes should go to jail for those crimes, that country would be Israel, right? On any given progressive value, you name it, Israel is the place you want to be. And I think it, on the contrary, rather than sort of going to progressives and sort of making this case, don't you get it, maybe it behooves them to think a little more seriously about what's happening there. I'm just saying that there ought to be a limit to how far we need to go to demonstrate the strength of our case. They ought to come towards us a little too.
So if you were a person of the left, I would be saying everything that you're saying now. And I'm going to push a little bit in the other direction. First of all, because I really do think we need to have something to argue about. But yeah. It's, you know, I forgot I was going to be on a stage, so I hope there's nobody taking pictures. But oh, you too? Maybe you're the problem there, Bret. So,
I would have gotten really booed if I wore my favorite Red Sox. Had to get it in, yeah.
I feel that there are two conversations that we as a people need to develop. There's the conversation that we have with the rest of the world, in which we need to say all of the things that you've said. And what we need to say very clearly to the rest of the world is, how dare you judge Israel? How dare you judge Israel, period, but how dare you judge Israel more harshly than you judge Israel's neighbors? So that's a conversation that we need. You know what, thank you, but I actually would prefer no applause, because we're really trying to have a conversation. And that's exactly my next point, which is there's the conversation that we need to have internally as a people. And that's a very different conversation. That's a conversation about, who do we want to be? Who do we want to be to our children? And I'm speaking now very much as an Israeli. When my kids ask me, and my kids do ask me, does this government really care about peace? And my kids are loyal, patriotic Israelis, and I believe that even this government does care about peace, parts of the government, and I believe that Netanyahu, if there was a chance for a genuine two-state agreement, would go for it. In fact, I'm quite sure of that. And Netanyahu, in a sense, reflects a majority consensus in Israel, which is that we want, in principle, we are for a two-state solution, and this is a majority position. In practice, we don't want to go anywhere near there yet because of all the reasons that you laid out. But in the internal conversation, and I find that we tend to confuse the two conversations. When I'm having a conversation about the future of Israeli society with fellow Jews, I'm not interested in hearing that Israel is a better society than Syria. Thank you very much. I want Israel to be as good in Israel as it can possibly be. When I'm having that conversation with outsiders, that's when I use my Syria card. And so in our own internal conversation, I want to know, what do we need to do to keep alive the hope of an eventual agreement of any kind with Israel and our neighbors? Now, I don't believe that a comprehensive agreement with the Palestinians is possible in this generation. Maybe an interim agreement is possible, working in conjunction with some of our new strategic allies in the Middle East, including, improbably, the Saudis, the Gulf states. The region is changing. One of the unintended gifts of the disastrous Iran deal was that it brought Arabs and Jews together. Now, Obama promised to bring Arabs and Jews together, and he did, against him. And that is, in fact, a potential gift to Israel and our ability to find our place in the Middle East. Now, we often forget, and this is true especially in the American Jewish community, that Israel actually exists in a region. And American Jews on the left forget that, as we've been discussing, that American Jews on the left tend to minimize the dangers that Israel faces in the Middle East. And American Jews on the right tend to forget that we are going to need to find our place in that region. That's my home. I need to find some way of figuring out how a Jewish state is going to exist, coexist in the region. Now, peace is not in the cards anytime soon. But between peace and absolute rejectionism, there are gradations of possibility. And I think we need to start thinking in more flexible terms. Now, when you talk about, Bret, when you talk about putting an offer on the table, that we don't always need to be putting the maximum offer on the table, I completely agree with you. But there are other offers we can put on the table. I don't believe, for example, and please no applause on this line, I don't believe that Israel can redivide Jerusalem. And I say that not necessarily for historic or religious reasons, for very practical security reasons. The offer that Ehud Barak put on the table in 2000 is now, to my mind, permanently off the table. For a very simple reason. If we were to redivide Jerusalem, the most likely Palestinian ruler to emerge there in East Jerusalem would be Hamas. And that, God forbid, is the destruction of Jerusalem. As a citizen of Jerusalem, I cannot preside over that threat. So I think that the kind of offer that I'm talking about, that Israel needs to put on the table, will be very different from the offers we've put on in the past, but we need to put some offer on the table, and again, not just for Israel's reputation internationally, but for our own credibility to ourselves, to Israelis, to young Israelis, and to ourselves as a people, when we need to really ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a people that is commanded by the Torah, Bakesh Shalom V'radfehu, seek peace and pursue it. Think about that extra little phrase, and pursue it. Why? Why is that added on? Why not just seek peace? And my reading of that verse is, we need to pursue peace even when peace is impossible. Even when we know that peace is impossible, we need to remain a people that is committed to the possibility, to the goal of peace. And one of the crimes for which I will never forgive Yasser Arafat is for turning Israelis and Jews around the world into people that hear the word peace and fear that it's a deception. Arafat poisoned the word peace. And we need to reclaim the credibility, the spiritual credibility of peace and of being a people that pursues peace.
Well, I thought that was beautifully said, but I think one role that someone like me can bring for an Israeli perspective is, I come to Israel, I don't know, once or twice a year, and I remember Israel when I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post. It wasn't just the height of the Second Intifada with these ghastly bombings taking place on a weekly or even daily basis. The economy was tanking. There was just a visible sense of decay. You walked through the streets of Jerusalem, things were shuttered. It was depressing. People talked about Israel being on the road to Argentina from an economic and social point of view. And every year I go back, and it just strikes me as better and better and better. And so many things that you probably don't notice by virtue of living, as it were, in the slipstream of Israeli life, you do notice when your visits are periodic. The vibrancy in Tel Aviv, the revival of so much of Jerusalem. I don't mean just economically, socially. The sense of wealth that infuses the society, the security, the confidence, the sense that you're no longer at the precipice, which was my experience back in 2002. And it's important, I think, to remind Israelis who spend their day reading it Haaretz, and everyone is a scoundrel, and the whole country's on the verge of fascism, and so forth and so on. This is reading Haaretz. That actually it's fantastic. The other day I was at an event in which an Arab-Israeli doctor who runs a hospital in the Galilee gave a presentation about Israel's treatment of now nearly 2,000 Syrian victims who have been brought surreptitiously across the border and given life-saving medical treatment that they couldn't get anywhere else. And I think, are we in America doing that for the Syrians? You're absolutely right. We shouldn't compare Israel to Syria or Egypt or these places. Let's compare Israel to the United States. Let's compare Israel to so many other countries that are Western, modern, 21st century democracies. How's Israel doing by that standard? I would say pretty well. Let's compare the way the United States military, and my respect for the US military couldn't be higher, deals with villages or targets it's about to bomb in the Pakistani hinterland or in Afghanistan versus the way Israel comported itself during the Gaza war. Does the United States drop leaflets from its drone saying, hey folks, we're about to hit you, women and children flee, or do we just attack? Now, not for a second am I faulting the United States for behaving the way you got to hit the terrorists, and that requires an element of surprise. But compare that to the way Israel managed to conduct intense urban warfare in Gaza, or the fact that Israel manages to make the decision to live with Hamas in Gaza, despite having gone through 3 wars since Hamas took over the enclave, because it doesn't want either to risk its own troops or innocent Palestinian life in a full-scale urban operation. I think that speaks extremely well for the moral caliber of the state in which you live. And yes, Jews are always That's the nature of our peoplehood. We're always asking ourselves, could we do a little bit better? Could we do a little bit more? But I think what Israel is doing strikes me as quite a lot, and that ought to be recognized. I think that there is a danger in which the exercise of our moral faculty, which is hugely important, becomes a form not of exercise but of moral self-excoriation. And when you talk about the conversation among Jews, I think that also ought to be part of that exercise, because what I hear from a lot of progressive left-wing Jews reminds me of this wonderful line from Eric Hoffer: Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a Christian nation. That's important to remember too. And I get back to what I was saying earlier. You know, you should, if God were truly just, he would have returned the people of Israel to political sovereignty in the western quadrant or southwestern quadrant of, say, Iceland, where all of our problems would have been cod fisheries, the occasional volcano, you know, these sorts of issues. And yet, not only do Jews return to sovereignty and statehood after a 2,000-year exile, but they return to it in the one place in the world where the exigencies of the exercise of power are the most excruciating, where every problem that confronts any Israeli prime minister, whether it's Ehud Barak and Rabin or Sharon and Netanyahu, is a difficult problem and a morally vexing problem, and where the reality of the choice of evils infects every dimension of statecraft. Now, to me, that commands, I should say, my highest respect, because the statesmen towards whom the statesmen I really admire are people like Abraham Lincoln, who suspended the writ of habeas corpus, okay? Because, as he said, I will not let the entire Constitution burn for this one writ. And people like Winston Churchill and Harry Truman, who undertook horrendous bombings of the enemy because they felt that there was a higher moral duty to win. If you respect a Churchill, if you respect a Truman, if you respect a Lincoln, if you think these were the leaders who command our highest respect, respect the fact that they were dealing with this constant agony that even the right choice would entail an evil. And I think that is the position in which Israeli decision makers, right or left, have found themselves. And I think that, as American Jews, is something we ought to be in awe of, because all we have to worry about is whether we're going to declare ourselves very for the environment or only sort of for the environment, right? Or other reasonably easy moral and political choices. What the Israelis do is something special, and I think you have to almost be outside of Israel to understand how extraordinary that is.
No, I completely agree, and I think there are two issues that we're discussing, and they shouldn't be conflated. The issue of how Israel protects itself is, as you say, exemplary, and in terms of Israel's dilemma, I would go farther than the way you described it, because I think it's even more extraordinary in that we are the only country in the world that faces enemies who don't accept its right to exist. And so we reclaimed power in an impossible region and under impossible circumstances. And I think in that sense, we have done remarkably well. And as far as our defense posture goes, I am very hawkish and unapologetically so. I think that, for example, we should have bombed Iran years ago, and I think we will. I think by default, it's going to be our responsibility. But I'm speaking about another issue, and that is the pursuit of some form of, call it reconciliation, call it easing of the conflict, is not a gift that we're doing to our neighbors. This is my interest. I need this. I need to find a way of ensuring that Israel remains faithful to the two non-negotiable elements of its identity, which is Israel as a Jewish state and Israel as a democratic state. If we lose either of those elements, Israel will not be Israel anymore. We will lose the loyalty of half the Jewish people if we lose one or the other of those identities. And so I see it as an existential need, as a security need for Israel to actively find ways of ending the threat to our identity, to our existence as a Jewish and democratic state. That's why I'm looking for ways to extricate myself from the situation that I'm in. And it's not to show the world that I'm a lover of peace. It is to be faithful to my own, first of all, my own self-interest, and secondly, yes, my own understanding of who the Jewish people is and what we've always represented.
Anyway, thank you very much, both of you, for coming. Really appreciate it. Yossi Klein Halevi and Bret Stephens.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card.